So let's get underway. How to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut. Sources are in the chat. Uh, this year, Yom Ha'atzmaut is going to be celebrated Wednesday night and Thursday. Yom Ha'atzmaut is officially recognized as the fifth day of Iyar, which is why we hardly ever celebrate it on the fifth day of Iyar. It's a typical Jewish style holiday that we celebrate on all days except its intended day. And that relates to the fact that the decision was made not to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut or commemorate Yom HaZikaron in proximity to Shabbos. We don't want the commemoration of Israel's Memorial Day or celebration of Independence Day to slide into Shabbos. So if any of the days, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha'atzmaut, fall on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday, it would lead to the possibility of violating Shabbos in one's returning from the commemorations or heading to the celebrations, remembering that the Jewish day starts at night. So it was determined that Yom Ha'atzmaut, if it falls out on a Friday or a Shabbos, then we move it up, make it earlier to the Thursday before, and if it falls out on a Sunday, we move it forward. And in many ways, this is a recognition of the fact that a Jewish state needs to be celebrated Jewishly and religiously, and keeping in mind the religious needs of Judaism, right? You don't want anyone to be violating Shabbos on their way to commemoration or celebration, even if they themselves don't care. And that was built into the establishment of Yom HaAtzmaut, both as a national holiday and a religious holiday. So this year we will be celebrating it on the third day of Iyar, which is Thursday, and it makes for all sorts of interesting ritual and synagogue service questions as to what we do on Thursday and Friday and Saturday. In a nutshell, Thursday we'll celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut by the special tefillot and prayers for Yom Ha'atzmaut. Friday is kind of a ordinary day, and Shabbos, which is technically the fifth of Iyar, also gets recognized as Yom Ha'atzmaut. It almost has a little bit of a feel of when Purim in Jerusalem falls out on Saturday. They divide it up around Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But really what we're here to explore more is this idea of a holiday, a religious holiday, celebrating the establishment of the state of Israel. Keeping in mind that on some level, what we're really looking at is the establishment of new holidays in general, whether it's the state of Israel or anything else. So let's go to the sources, right? This is our rip from the headline. So our headline comes from May 14th, 1948, from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Jews throughout the U.S. celebrate proclamation of a state. Weitzman greets the Yishuv. The Jewish community of the United States joined Jews in Israel and throughout the world today in celebrating the establishment of Jewish state. Special Thanksgiving services were held tonight in synagogues throughout the country, and additional services were planned for tomorrow. Jewish leaders, including Dr. Chaim Weitzman, Dr. Abba Hillel Silver, and others, hailed the establishment of Israel in a statement issued in New York this afternoon. Right, plenty of other headlines. We could have a whole class reading some of those headlines, but the state of Israel is declared, and we see that is being celebrated in synagogues. Everyone is very enthusiastic with this new development for the Jewish people. And one would say the hard part for the Jewish state was just beginning, because now it had to fight a war against 5 Arab armies coming in from all fronts. And this moment was a very easy moment from a religious perspective. This is great, right? It doesn't really matter where you are coming from a religious perspective. It's wonderful that there's a place for Jews in Israel, with minor exceptions, which we'll come to. Everyone was excited by the possibilities of what a Jewish state could mean. So soon after the Shoah, a place for Jews to go, a place for Judaism to thrive. Of course, moving forward, Israel got into a much better place militarily and politically with its neighbors, and of course, it gets more complicated religiously, because once the aura of the excitement wears off, well, then how is this going to play out from a religious perspective? And religion in the state of Israel. Well, it's a Jewish state, but how does it play itself out is, of course, a broad and vast subject that touches upon all sorts of political, social, economic issues when it comes to the state of Israel. But at the moment a state is declared, it's a good thing. The one exception in this attitude was the approach that we'll see later on, as typified by the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who saw Zionism as what he referred to as Ma'aseh Satan, as the devil's work. But for the most part, that was more of an outlying view at the moment. 1948, Hey Iyar, wonderful opportunity. In fact, Hey Iyar was the Independence Day to be sensitive to Shabbos, because May 14th, 1948 was a Friday, and the British mandate expired at midnight, May 14th into May 15th. And had they waited till that moment to declare the independence, when would it have been? It would have been on Shabbos. And Ben-Gurion knew he could not declare a state of Israel on Shabbos, so they moved up the meeting so that it took place in the afternoon, even though the British mandate had not yet expired, because they were sensitive to Shabbos from the very get-go. So this is the moment that, where an unbelievable Jewish dream is coming true, and shortly thereafter became questions of how should it be commemorated. So each of us has our way of celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. We may have our preconceived opinions and notions or earlier studies on the subject, but we're going to approach it from the perspective of having a new festival. How do we have a new holiday? And is this moment in Jewish history, the establishment of the state of Israel, worthy of such a holiday? And so, those two questions, can be answered the same way or differently. Maybe we can't have a new holiday. If you can't have a new holiday, we're done. There's nothing to talk about. If you could have a new holiday, well, what about establishing the state of Israel? Is that a way to have? Is that enough of a reason to have a new holiday? If the answer to that question is also yes, then you have, both check boxes checked, double green light, celebrate completely. Well, if you can have a new holiday, but the establishment of a state of Israel is not enough for that, well, you still have one red light and you can't fully engage and celebrate. So these are kind of the variables that we'll be looking at throughout.
Rabbi Weinstock, excuse me, just for a moment.
Mhm.
Isn't it correct that during this time, there was still all this suffering in Jerusalem and they were starving them, or that was?
Yes.
No, it
Yes,
was like
there was suffering all over.
It was almost
in
like a
places.
Tisha B'Av. It was almost like a Tisha B'Av.
Correct. So that could be a reason why it's not enough of a celebration. There are those who feel that, for example, and maybe we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks, that it's actually Yom Yerushalayim, which has much more of a celebratory aura, because it is a day that meant a victory and a reunification of Jerusalem, and that has more that has more joyous significance than the declaration of the state, which, like we said before, that's when that's when it got difficult. It was all downhill from there in terms of celebrating at that moment, but the rest of it was war. So it's really analyzing it going forward, the idea of a Yom HaAtzmaut, which becomes the question, and on both levels. One, a new holiday. Two, is that moment enough to be considered the new holiday? And that's what we're going to start looking at from a couple different perspectives. One of the unique approaches in this, and keeping in mind, just because people may be giving us some sources in one direction doesn't necessarily even mean that they're necessarily very strong advocates of celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. As an example, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav from Yeshiva University, was president of the Religious Zionists of America. He had left his family tradition of being negative or ambivalent towards Zionism to embracing the Jewish state. Gave a very powerful talk about the Jewish state called Kol Dodi Dofek, which several years after the establishment would set out the real religious underpinnings of a connection to the Jewish state, not just Israel. He was not a big fan of creating new rituals and was not in favor of saying Hallel Yom HaAtzmaut. It's one thing to thank God and see it as a positive, but it's quite another to create a new holiday on the Jewish calendar. So, that's so that's one example of someone who's very much in favor of the Jewish state, but not necessarily celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. But what we're trying to look at is how to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut. Like I said, I'm coming from a perspective we should be celebrating it, and some of these sources contribute to what I believe is that approach and makes that the correct approach. So the Talmud in Sanhedrin, source number 1, says Rabbi Yehuda said 3 mitzvot were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into Eretz Yisrael. Right, when the Jews, after 40 years in the desert, entered the land of Israel, they were commanded to establish a king for themselves, to cut off the seed of Amalek in war, and to build the chosen house, to build the temple in Jerusalem. And so there are those who look at this idea of entering the land of Israel, that it's not just that original time that this was what the Jews had this commandment, but after the destruction of the first temple, the second Commonwealth, they also had the same responsibility. And some would say that now the Jews are back in Israel, we are now activating this Talmudic timeline of the Jews returning to their homeland. And there's a responsibility to set up a government, destroy Amalek, and ultimately build the temple. And even if we haven't accomplished everything, well, we are certainly on our way. There's a Jewish government. There's battling our enemies and working to destroy the evil. We don't have Amalek anymore, so we don't have to cut them off completely in war, but we're defending ourselves. And then eventually there'll be the building of the temple. And so, for example, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, Yeshiva University, points out that this idea of entering the land applies with the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel and the creation of a state of Israel. We're on our way. And the idea of celebrating this being on our way in terms of rebuilding the land of Israel, he sees there as being sources in the Jewish tradition, authoritative source in the Jewish tradition, that we have a commandment to celebrate this return and rebuilding of the land. So he points to the Ramban. The Ramban is in Bamidbar, chapter 7, verse 13. And he's not talking about entering the land of Israel. He's actually talking about the sacrifices and special gifts and offerings that were brought by the Nisi'im, the princes, when they were entering, when they were dedicating the tabernacle, dedicating the Mishkan. And the Ramban on this in these verses mentions that the princes, source number 2, dedicated the altar with all kinds of offerings that can be brought upon it. Right? They went all out. They brought whatever sacrifices they could. Therefore, they brought a meal offering, incense, a burnt offering, a sin offering, a peace offering. Very nice, right? Well, it's not that simple. The incense and the sin offering were permitted to be brought by a special temporary decree, since they cannot usually be brought as free will offerings. Right? The Nisi'im, the princes, were bringing all of these sacrifices, but usually you don't just bring a sin offering, because you need a sin to bring a sin offering. You need specific conditions to bring the incense. And here they were just bringing all these gifts to God out of celebration of the dedication of the tabernacle. So Nachmanides says, this exception was made in order to complete the dedication with all kinds of offerings. For no other offerings can be brought in Israel except for these offerings mentioned here. The sin and the guilt offering being the same thing and having the same name, there's only one law for them. Now the glorious God agreed to the intention of the princes and commanded they shall present their offering, each prince on his day. Therefore it is possible that this is a commandment for all generations, that the sanctuary and the altar should always be dedicated with special offerings upon their completion. It's for this reason that Solomon made a dedication in the house of God. Similarly, the men of the great assembly dedicated the second temple, and so it will be in the days of the Messiah. So Ramban is talking about that there's a need for a celebration, a special religious celebration more than usual, when there's the dedication of the tabernacle, when there's the dedication of the first temple, the dedication of the second temple, and ultimately dedication of the third temple. And so Rabbi Schachter sees in this a rationale that there remains upon us a religious responsibility to celebrate as the fulfillment of the order of returning to the land is accomplished. Right? We don't have a temple yet, but we've started returning to the land, and therefore upon us is the responsibility to celebrate that dedication with religious with the religious order. Now, once upon a time it was sacrifices, but he's threading the needle of a return of the Jewish people to Israel, the same way when they first got there, in the times of the first temple, the second temple, and now in this third commonwealth, when there is a return to Israel, we have a religious responsibility to continue to celebrate. We have a religious responsibility to dedicate this religiously, to recognize this religiously, this return to Israel. We also see a precedent for this in the holiday of Purim. Gives us a lot of insight into this idea of a new holiday, because when we think about it, Purim was a new holiday. Right? There was no Purim in the Torah, and the salvation of Purim creates a new holiday, a holiday that lasts for generations. Hanukkah also provides us with some indication as to how to celebrate this. But again, Purim and Hanukkah are both really about commemorating specific historical events. They don't necessarily open up the door to having new religious holidays. But when it comes to Purim, right, the Sfat Emet, the Hasidic rabbi of Gur, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Alter, writes in source number 3, it's in Hebrew, we'll translate it, says that the idea of Purim, what made Purim more of a holiday was that it was Hachana Levinyan Bayit Sheni. It laid the foundation for the second temple. And this is the idea of that is the level of creation of institution of a religious spiritual holiday, that the men of the Great Assembly were now able to, going from the Purim story, to build the second temple. And therefore it was at this time that the Jewish nation is pivoting into the second temple era. And they have to, one of the things that's required for this, like the Talmud and Sanhedrin says, is you have to destroy Amalek. Right, to get back into the land, you have to enter the land, have a government, have a destruction of your enemies, and then build a temple. And therefore, this is what's going on. And there's a mitzvah when entering the land to do this. And this was the Purim is the setting of the stage for the second commonwealth. And therefore, Rabbi Schachter sees Purim as a setting a precedent for a holiday whose nature is about laying the foundation for a Jewish commonwealth. Yes, Ellie, you have a question.
I'm just amazed by these different things that you're bringing up. I mean, the fact that Israel, I mean, we're talking about what we've been through thousands of years, and now, even after the state of Israel, to have the 6-Day War, which I felt was more of a miracle, and the Yom Kippur War that we survived, than Hanukkah or Purim. I mean, it's just behooves me to think that we would take one moment in time out of a whole year to say, you know what, Hashem, thank you for Am Yisrael.
Well, that's something we can do every day, and I think that what we're
we do it every day in davening.
Correct. So so one would say, so why do you need a Yom Ha'atzmaut?
Well, Yom Ha'atzmaut is to keep people connected, to get people more connected, to know and to appreciate that we have an Am Yisrael.
So like I said, we agree on that. The question is why, and the question is, can we base that on Torah sources, or is that only based upon how we feel? And
like Hanukkah, we don't read Hanukkah. Do we read Hallel on Hanukkah?
We do.
Right, amazing. On Hallel.
But the rabbi, correct? But the rabbis instituted it. We don't have a Sanhedrin anymore, and so I think that what we're trying to explore is that I'm assuming that of the people on our Zoom, there are few, if any, who object to celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. At the same time, I'd like to dig a little bit more deeply to create a foundation that it's not that not only do we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Ha'atzmaut is the right way religiously. as much as there's an obligation to keep Shabbos and kosher, there's an obligation, a religious obligation for Yom HaAtzmaut. And to do that, we have to speak the language of religious obligation. And that's the direction those are the sources we're exploring.
You know, it's interesting. They have a mission called March of the Living. They go to Auschwitz, and then 3 days later they come into Israel for Yom HaAtzmaut, and only then do you realize and appreciate. Thank God, Hashem, that we have a state of Israel.
Right, but there too. Look, and we spoke about it earlier in the year. Yom HaShoah is complicated, right?
Yeah.
And we spoke a little bit last week, but religiously speaking, there are religious Jews who will only act if it's the religious language. And Yom HaShoah does not have religious language. Tisha B'Av has religious language, and Yom HaAtzmaut does not have religious language. Hanukkah and Purim have religious language. And what I think is incumbent upon us is to recognize and show that we're not just speaking a different language than those who don't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut. We have the same language. We are more open to some of these sources. And so when we're talking about having a holiday, well, the Hanukkah and Purim have their precedent. They're in the Talmud, right? And as we've said before, the Talmud, right, whatever's in the Talmud, if it's in there, it's binding, right? If it's not in there, it might still be binding, but if it's in there, it's binding. And Yom HaAtzmaut's not in the Talmud. So what can we find about our existing celebrations that might carry over into Yom HaAtzmaut and give us and create for Yom HaAtzmaut a parallel or place in Jewish spiritual, religious, and legal responsibility? And so it starts with recognizing that Judaism sees Hanukkah, sees Purim. Even further back, Judaism sees the entry into the land and the fulfillment of our mission in the land as worthy of celebration. Right? That's how the Ramban looked at the dedication of the altar. It's time to celebrate. When we enter the land, it's time to celebrate. Purim, what made Purim so compelling as a religious holiday, said the Sfat Emet? Because it was part of that pivoting into the Second Commonwealth. Again, not the laws of Purim, but the ethos of Purim. Right? Because the laws are the laws regardless of the ethos. But the way the Sfat Emet sees the ethos of Purim, right, we can see that echoed in a third Commonwealth. Source number 4, Rabbi Yaakov Lorberbaum, in his commentary. Rabbi Yaakov Lorberbaum was a 19th century scholar and rabbi and a legal scholar, and also who wrote a commentary to the book of Megillah, to Megillat Esther. And so he says that this idea of Purim as a Yom Tov, how did that come about? Why did that come about? Source number 4, also Gam Ken Yom Tov, they made a holiday, Shilfi Datam Shiro Mechiat Amalek. They saw Haman's downfall as the destruction of Amalek. They saw this as the beginning of the redemption. Atchalta de Geula is a language a lot of people also utilize when they talk about the state of Israel. It's the beginning of the redemption. Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. So Rabbi Lorberbaum is saying that the Jews in Persia saw this as Atchalta de Geula. Right, it should have been the same. Right, but sin got in the way. When there's the beginning of a redemption, that you should make a holiday, just like we did after the first one, like Pesach. So there's this idea that, again, it's not a full redemption. They're not back in the land yet. Purim is complicated. And one of the reasons we don't say Hallel and Purim is that it didn't take place in Israel. Right? There are 3 reasons we don't say Hallel and Purim. One is that it didn't take place in Israel. 2 is that we have a Megillah. 3 is that it didn't lead to independence, because Purim, the Achashverosh was still in control. So these are the 3 reasons that we don't say Hallel and Purim. Didn't take place in Israel. We have a Megillah already for it. We don't need Hallel and a Megillah, and there was no independence. If you talk about the establishment of the state of Israel, it did take place in Israel. There is no Megillah, and we do have independence. And so, if we talk about just this idea of the Jews understanding the ethos of Purim as coming as it represented a step in the right direction towards redemption. And seeing also the idea that the entry into the land of Israel, towards the establishment of what we're supposed to be doing in the land of Israel, is worthy of celebration. And these are not, therefore, these are very familiar and traditional categories, which can then be applied to an idea of celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut as a genuine religious holiday. And so that's, again, it like Elliot said, thank God for Israel. You don't need to give me any excuse to eat falafel and blue and white cookies. We, that Yom HaAtzmaut, that's the day of the calendar. We do it great. At the same time, it's not merely just being grateful, not merely just recognizing the obvious, but it's creating a religious foundation, a religious and spiritual foundation, which I think is critical, because as we have mentioned, and we will see, some feel that this is all hocus pocus make-believe. And again, so we can ignore that side of things, but I think it's appropriate from a religious and halachic and spiritual vantage point to bolster the foundations for what we believe is the religious obligation of celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. So that's building up a religious foundation for Yom HaAtzmaut. It is built on two pillars. One, the obligation to celebrate the process of fulfilling our mission in the land of Israel, and as well as seeing from the Purim story, celebrating the beginning of that process is also worthy of celebration, in that it was part of the ethos of Purim celebration. What are some of the things that might stand in the way of creating a new holiday? So one is this idea that, look, we don't add to the Torah, right? The Torah says explicitly, we don't add. So Ramban, who from elsewhere gave us a little bit of a springboard to actually celebrating fulfilling our mission in Israel, when he talked about how it's still a celebration today to celebrate the dedication of the temple, or the process of that dedication. Ramban in source number 5 says, in my opinion, even creating a new mitzvah by itself, such as the holiday which Yeravam made up in the book of Kings, violates the prohibition of adding to the Torah. Similarly, they said regarding the reading of the Megillah, there are 180 prophets who prophesied for Israel, and they did not subtract or add to what is written in the Torah, even one letter, except for the reading of the Megillah. Here the Ramban notes that we can't add anything. And in fact, Purim may have been a stretch. So does this mean we really shouldn't be adding on anything? Is there no opportunity to add on? And so here we have to start, we should take a step back, because when we're talking about adding holidays, it's not only Yom HaAtzmaut, it's not only the Zionist days or the modern state of Israel days which lead us to analyze this. Throughout Jewish history, there have been days that were special days, days of salvation. Let's face it, the Jews have been oppressed all sorts of ways in all sorts of places throughout the entirety of our history. And there are a number of private days of salvation that are recorded by various authorities for various communities or even various families. So, for example, there was one, Rabbi Avram Danzig he lived in Vilna around the same time as the Vilna Gaon, and his family was saved from a fire, and so they commemorated that for the family as a day of celebration. There are numerous private communal Purim celebrations that are observed within the Jewish world, because historically there were communities that were facing annihilation, evil decree by whichever anti-Semite of the time there was, and they were saved and spared, and they created a Purim of these communities, and this is recorded in various books of Jewish law. And so, is this okay or is this not okay? Right? Ramban seems to have a difficulty with it. But what about the fact that we have to give thanks and recognize what God's salvation, right? Gratitude is everything, but especially if we have family miracles. In fact, one of the blessings that's mentioned in the Talmud is if you see a place where a miracle was performed for one's family, you can say a special bracha. Now, how does one define a miracle or not? A separate conversation. But we know there is precedent in Jewish history of special days being declared for families or communities to celebrate a salvation. Well, Yom HaAtzmaut is pretty relevant to many, many, many families, if not the Jewish world. Why not look at it like that? Look at it similarly. So we do, and it just happens to be that there is a machloket. There's a dispute as to whether that warning light raised by the Ramban about adding new holidays is that really an absolute, or is it more along the lines of, as the discussion is, what does it mean to add to the Torah? Add to the Torah is you obligate and mandate upon everybody a certain mode of behavior that's as binding as a mitzvah, right? So that would be a problem. But having one community commemorating its salvation with a holiday that it declares for itself, right? And they're not going to say it has all the laws of Shabbos and all the laws of a Pesach Seder where there's an obligation to eat matzah. It's not the same level of obligation. So maybe the Ramban, there's room to allow it. Or do we have to understand that idea literally? So there's a machlokas. There's a machlokas there are two schools of thought on this subject. One is presented in source number 6, Rabbi Chizkiah da Silva, author of the Pri Chadash, and he says there are some people, yesh ksat yechidim b'doreinu zeh, people she'al yidei she'iru lahem nisim kavu bo sam yamim yom tov l'doros. They established a holiday for miraculous salvations. They said this is a holiday for the generations in this place. He says it mentions it in Egypt even. Od hayom yirah lahem nes kadosh kavosu yom mishev simcha l'doros. They had this idea in Egypt. V'gam b'tshuas Maharam al Shakar, there's one of the great legal authorities says that Yirach hashatikin lasas yom echad l'chodesh teves ki yom Purim l'chol dvarav k'dei l'farsem nes echad kadosh naslam boso yom. They actually made the 11th of Teves into a Purim with all of the trimmings to celebrate a great miracle that happened there. Is this okay or not? Is this practice okay? Is there legitimacy? He says, I say, at the end of the day, these are only these are optional elements of their practice. And even if you practice it for a few years, you can just stop. It's not binding, right? We have an idea, and this is something we do before Rosh Hashanah. It's called Hatarat Nidarim. We annul vows. And we say that if I've accepted upon myself a positive practice, and I don't want to do it anymore, I need permission to stop doing it. And here the Pri Chadash says, no, these types of holidays, if you're from a community that had this as a holiday, it's never binding on you. It's all completely optional. And if you've been doing this for several generations and one generation wants to stop, you could stop. It's not binding. We don't have these additional holidays. Right? We don't have communal rabim. We don't have public communal holidays. Certainly, we're not going to say that a private commemoration like this is binding. So the Pri Chadash takes this idea that adding a new holiday does not have a religious obligational manner. It doesn't necessarily say that it's forbidden, but he does say that you can't establish it with any sense of religious binding practice and the like. But as we said, there are those who disagree. Source number 7, Magen Avram, Rabbi Avram Gombiner is writing that Yecholim b'nei ha'ir l'taken v'haskama u'bacharam alehem v'alabayim achareihem lasos purim b'yom shana sabones haram al shakar. He quotes that source and says, no, if they agree and if they adopt it, they can declare for them to make a Purim, to make a real holiday for them and future generations on a day that a miracle happened to them. And so here we have a significant point of departure. that can you make a new holiday or not? Well, there are those who embrace it that you could make a new holiday, and that does seem to be the more standard accepted practice, the way the Magen Avraham sets it, because we know throughout Jewish history numerous Purim like holidays established by families and communities. And though there are those who say no, they follow the Pri Chadash. And so, if initially we saw that there's an on-ramp to creating a religious ethos to Yom HaAtzmaut based on religious precedents of celebrating the dedication of the land, or celebrating the pivot towards dedicating the land, like in the tabernacle commemoration, dedication, or in the Purim celebration, that either, that is the on-ramp. And then we either can open the door to have a celebration like Maharam al-Shakar and these private Purims, or we're now stymied by the Pri Chadash saying we can't have new holidays. But certainly we have the on-ramp of the religious ethos, and we can open the door with Maharam al-Shakar and have a celebration of a Yom HaAtzmaut. And then others may want to keep the door closed by adopting the practice of the Pri Chadash and no new holidays, period. Questions, comments, reactions? Before moving it in the direction, we'll talk a little bit about the ritual of saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, and then look at a couple of responses about Yom HaAtzmaut, and then conclude that with a very interesting incident. Okay, so clearly feeling that something,
Rabbi,
yeah.
what is your view as to whether there should be flexibility?
Well, I'm a very flexible person, right? I talk to all kinds of people. I think
Even
that,
me.
so I think that look, I began by saying I'm a big believer in that there's a religious obligation to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut. And, at the same time, what I'm presenting here is what I feel is the religious foundation that's based upon. It's based upon this sense of a requirement to celebrate the pivot towards redemption, a la Purim. Okay, can we make it a real holiday? Yes, we can make it a real holiday. That's what Maharam al-Shakar said. That's what the Magen Avraham says and records from Jewish precedents and history. However, the Pri Chadash would stop those, but I don't think that we have to follow the Pri Chadash when it comes to, we certainly have precedent. Now, in terms of what about saying Hallel? Well, the Talmud about saying Hallel says, who recites Hallel? Source number 8, the prophets among them ordained that Israel should recite it at every important epoch and every misfortune may not come upon them. Right? For all salvations are all near misses, and when we're saved, we say Hallel. And when they are redeemed, they recite in gratitude for their redemption. So Hallel is something that has a lot of latitude. We say Hallel when we are redeemed. Great, wonderful. So Yom HaAtzmaut, we're redeemed. So say Hallel. Now, the issue is that this statement in the Talmud doesn't necessarily get carried over into Jewish law. We don't have a section in the Code of Jewish Law that tells us when to say Hallel, when not to say Hallel, when to say it with a bracha, when not to say it with a bracha. But I do think that we have here this Talmudic statement that helps us understand that Hallel is about when there is salvation, coupled with what we said before. We don't say Hallel when it's not in Israel and when there's another reading to take its place and when there's no independence. Well, Yom HaAtzmaut provides a perfect recipe. There's a salvation and it meets the criteria for saying Hallel, similar to Hanukkah. It's unlike Purim. There's room for Hallel. And I think that's the direction those who do say Hallel and Yom HaAtzmaut are going in that direction. Again, sometimes, as we said before, just because one sees the on-ramp to a religious sense of celebration because of the direction of the state of Israel, again, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go through the door of creating a new holiday.
1 minute, give me a minute.
Because the Pri Chadash stands in your way. And it also doesn't mean you're necessarily going to say Hallel, because you may say it's a holiday and we should celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, but I don't see the criteria. I'm not going to go all the way and say Hallel with a blessing because of I don't have the right guidance in the Jewish tradition. But we're certainly paving a road for the approach that I feel very strongly about, that we have the ethos of celebration as we pivot towards redemption, even it's the beginning of redemption like Purim was. We have precedent for setting new holidays that celebrate salvations, and we have the opportunity to celebrate that with saying Hallel. And that is kind of the religious Zionist approach to Yom HaAtzmaut. Rabbi Meshulam Roth, writing early in the state of Israel's existence about Yom HaAtzmaut, source number 9. Indeed, there's no doubt that that day, the 5th of Iyar, which was established by the government and the members of the parliament, were elected representatives of the people and the majority of the great rabbis to celebrate through the land to commemorate our salvation, our freedom. It's a mitzvah to make it a day of happiness and Yom Tov to recite Hallel. Boom, right? But it's not just a statement necessarily coming out of we're happy about this as a state. This is built upon there being a religious on-ramp of celebrating the process of redemption and the ability to have holidays and the ability to say Hallel. And that's what the view that Rabbi Roth is capturing in a halachic response very briefly and succinctly, not just because it's great that there's a state and we love Israel, but I think it's built upon the different steps that we have seen in exploring, the religious background of this as well. Just before the comment, I just want to point out that there's another side of this. There's another school of thought which does not look as kindly upon the steps that we took towards this direction. And we're going to look at that with a couple of lines in source number 10, the response of Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, someone who is a great legal scholar, but coming from the non-Zionist or anti-Zionist camp. Yes, Elliot.
I guess it's just not the culmination of Israel as we were talking about, but all those children of Israel that gave up their life to fight for having a state of Israel. I mean, they weren't part of the Rabbanut or whatever. These were our children of Israel that gave up their lives that we should have a state of Israel.
Oh yeah,
Amen.
All right, good. Look, I don't think there's any dispute, and even in those who don't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, in denying that or minimizing that. I think that there's, rhetoric aside, and we're going to see a little bit of rhetoric in the next source. There's a genuinely different religious worldview. And I think that we've seen this path. Again, we started with the idea of celebrating the beginning of a redemption, and that we still have a responsibility to celebrate the process of redemption, using Purim as a precedent. All right, look, in the aftermath of the state of Israel starting, there were a lot of Shehechianus and Baruch Hashems and celebratory statements by rabbis of all stripes. But then what happens next? Does that mean that there's room for a new holiday? Well, some would say yes, and some would say no. Now, I will grant you that those who want to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut are more likely to grasp onto the more Maharam al-Shakar, Magen Avram precedent. And those who are less inclined, that will say, no, I can't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut. The Pri Chadash says I'm not allowed to. And when it comes to those who still are sympathetic towards a Yom HaAtzmaut religious celebration, well, they're not necessarily going to say Hallel because, hey, wait a second. No one told me I'm allowed to, so I'm just going to stand back and not say Hallel with a bracha.
Right,
And it's taking place in the Omer period. Wait a second. How can I celebrate if it's during the Omer? So, at each step along the way, there can be a lot of agreement, but just, making a different pivot towards what leads to a very different conclusion. Yes, Rose.
It's a reminder of Nahal Haredi, very special. They go off blue and white, but they really are, from people. And when they come back, their reconnection in their, reinstitution to their sect is very difficult. It's an uphill battle. So unfortunately, they can't cross their line. I know sometimes, Right.
And look, I look, and I think this is a very fluid world in which we live in. As complicated as it is in the Haredi community, for those in the Haredi community who want to serve in the army, that number is growing by leaps and bounds, where it was 5 and 10 years ago. So, we're in this for the long game, and we're probably going to see a great evolution in attitudes and approaches in the near term, certainly in the long term. So Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, a Dayan in Jerusalem, wrote in 1968, right after 1967 Six-Day War, there was another blip on the celebratory radar in terms of Yom Yerushalayim. Now, just note, Yom Yerushalayim is really only celebrated in Israel in Yerushalayim and among the religious community. Yom Yerushalayim is not moved to accommodate Shabbos, Sunday, Friday. If it's on Friday, it's on Friday. If it's on Sunday, it's on Sunday. It's much more a religious commemoration. But in the aftermath of that, there are those who are upset that they have now another day that they want to say Hallel. And Rabbi Weiss writes, there's some to our pain, to our chagrin, there are those, among the lesser of the nation, that when their holiday comes, they've decided to say Hallel with a bracha according to their rabbis. And there are those who also stop observing some of the sadness of the Omer, as is mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. I've decided to write a piece so I can explain exactly what is proper here. And he's not happy by this, and that he says this is in the end of the fourth line. Lulei chaste Hashem shehosir lanu es Rav Hakadosh Misatmar. Thank God we have the Satmar Rebbe. Asher karo anem an hishmiya es devar Hashem loches. He's told us the unadulterated word of God in his book that he wrote to explain to us, the right way of going. And the Satmar Rebbe is, of course, famous in his anti-Zionism. And not to be confused with the Neturei Karta, who are just seemingly almost anti-Semitic. But the Satmar Rebbe presented an anti-Zionist approach, a religious anti-Zionist approach, and was very against the state of Israel. And so Rabbi Weiss is saying, thank God, well, at least we have that religious approach out there to guide us. And he then quotes one of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi leaders of the time. Someone wanted to know, they asked Rabbi Yaakov Kanievsky, you may hear in the news, Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky is Rabbi Yaakov Kanievsky's son, who was asked about saying Hallel with a bracha on the 28th of Iyar, Jerusalem Day. And he says, Zehu Isur Chamur V'Norah Shel Bracha Levatal V'Shel Akiras Yesodos B'Dinei Torasenu Hakdosha. This is basically pulling the rug out from under the foundations of our Torah, right? Which is a little definitely rhetorical, but it highlights the opposition that existed in that ultra Orthodox community.
But it's reality that Hallel is Tehillim.
Right, but to say it as Hallel with a bracha was problematic. Look, many like to quote that you don't have to take a doctrinaire attitude to this. They say you should do what Ben Gurion did on Yom Ha'atzmaut. He didn't say Tachnun and he didn't say Hallel. Right. Ben Gurion didn't daven. So
well, he couldn't read Hebrew. So you have that, you have that attitude. So again, source number 10, Rabbi Weiss presents us with an approach that is the very opposite, because it's not coming with a gracious approach towards wanting to celebrate. It comes from, this is bad from the get-go. I mean, and like we said, the Satmar Rebbe really went to the extreme in describing what he viewed as the evil of the state of Israel being in existence. It's one thing for Jews to be safe, but it's quite another if that has to be through the vehicle of a secular state. But again, the goal was to lay out the religious foundations for celebrating even the beginning in a pivot towards a redemption, as well as seeing an opportunity to create new holidays around salvations, which we have a precedent for, and to celebrate it in a way that has with it a religious declaration of Hallel. And that's the approach that the religious Zionist community, many in the state of Israel, take, as personified by Rabbi Roth. And then you have those who may be more open to this, like a Rabbi Soloveitchik, who sees the glory of the state of Israel, but doesn't want to turn it into a holiday.
And then you have those who are more negative on the state of Israel as a whole. I want to just conclude, there's a magazine called HaMizrahi put out by the by the World Mizrahi. And there's an article, Rabbi Yosef Blau, about celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut in America in the 1950s. And he writes about having his Bnei Akiva experience. Bnei Akiva has a festive prayer service and a chagiga, a party. At one, I was asked why I hadn't shaved. Right? Why I hadn't shaved, because, since I should treat Yom Ha'atzmaut as a holiday. So uncomfortable with deciding on my own, I called Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, the leading halachic authority from the event. I didn't ask Rav Soloveitchik, who's Rabbi Blau's Rebbe, because I knew he permitted shaving during Sfira. It's a whole separate conversation about not getting haircuts and shaving during Sfira, and Rabbi Soloveitchik says you're allowed to shave during Sfira. So here's Rabbi Blau, a young person calling up MTJ, and Rabbi Feinstein answered the phone himself. I wasn't even one of his students. He asked me if I considered it a holiday. When I replied yes, he said I should shave. I'm not aware of any written version of this response. So here, what stands out and what is important in how we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut is, what do you think? Do you think it should be a holiday? And that, so it's a very wise response from Rabbi Feinstein, who was not part of the more Zionist approach, nor was he the anti-Zionist approach. But it's the idea of, we should celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut based on how we look and we relate to the state of Israel.
I never met Hashem, but I know Hashem, I'm sure, is thrilled up there, wherever he is, to just say, I'm
What do you mean you never meet Hashem?
Appreciate.
You meet Hashem, you meet Hashem whenever you daven.
I meet him even during davening, after davening, I meet with him. I understand, but
Right.
I mean, if the whole theory of this thing, they take an Ashrei, Yoshrei, and they add 2 sentences to it from Tehillim, but that's okay. These are things that
Right.
my
It's all based that the Medina was created by non-Jewish people. It is. That's the
Oh,
bottom line.
not observant.
I don't
not
count
observant.
Say non-religious.
Right.
Is this Rabbi
Well.
Yosef Blau from YU?
Yes.
Was
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
his wife?
well,
my-
Rabbi Goren was right happy
Yes,
about
yeah.
it. I'll tell you that, though. Rabbi
No,
Goren was
look,
right at the
the
coattail.
majority of the religious leadership in Israel, when Israel was created, was definitely in favor. Look, the
Rabbi, the
demographics
touch
have
the-
changed. Even in the religious Zionist community has changed. But we're
To
talking
touch
again
the
of
just to touch the wall of the base of Mikdash. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
the
This
retaining
place-
wall, the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. Again, like I said at the very beginning, each of us relates to Israel in different ways, in different levels of religiosity and intensity. I think that, as we see from the Rabbi Feinstein's answer to Rabbi Blau, that clearly shapes how we are going to relate to celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. But what I hope we've also been able to see is that there is definitely a traditional religious on-ramp that provides the halachic justification and even mandate for celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut.
And who is the top rabbi